Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another session of New Directions, another breakout session in today's New Directions conference. This session is called Co-Constructing Assessment Criteria for EFL Writing by Instructors and Students, a participative approach to constructively aligning CEFR, curricula, teaching and learning. Today's presenter, hello everyone, welcome back. Sorry, excuse me. Today's presenter is Dr. Huahui Jiao. Dr. Jiao is a lecturer in language education at the University of Leeds. She has been teaching and supervising EFL teacher trainers with various teaching experiences from different cultural backgrounds. She has published widely in these two areas in key journals, including Assessing Writing, Learning and Instruction, British Journal of Educational Technology, ELT Journal, and Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. So without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Jiao for her presentation.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how we can empower learners as assessors to co-create accessible, feasible, and useful self-assessment grades. This is part of a project funded by British Council. So in this presentation, I'm going to firstly talk about the background of the project. I'll briefly introduce the project and then talk about the procedures I follow to adapt assessment criteria to local instructional context. And then I will also talk about how the research team improved the accessibility by using students and tutors' perceptions. So this project started in 2016 in a context that the Department of Education in China introduced China's Standards of English Language Ability. So this has been published in 2018 with the aim at improving the coherence, transparency, and efficiency of English language assessment, curricula, and education in China, and also, of course, develop learners' autonomy. If we have a close look at the China Standards of English Language Ability, we can see it is very similar to Common CEFR or Common European Framework. So in CEFR, again, it is action-oriented framework, use can-do statement. For self-assessment, use I can statement. For China Standards English Language Ability, they also have three levels, okay? Elementary stage, intermediate stage, advanced stage. At each stage, there are three different levels. They also use can-do statements. And for the self-assessment grade, it is I can statement. Well, for the common framework, one of the things is for us to think about is how a context-free, though by no means a context-indifferent framework like CEFR or like CSE can and should and even must be translated to context-relevant forms in diverse educational environments in order to be implemented effectively. As for the CSE, we do need to think about how the self-assessment descriptors can be applied in local instructional context because students, teachers, instruction focus, and the assessment method could be very different from each other. And how can they be aligned with teaching and learning so it can facilitate learning, facilitate teaching, and develop a learner's learning autonomy? So this project was conducted in 2016, but the data started collected in 2017. It follows three stages. The first stage, creating the assessment criteria. Then we use assessment criteria to introduce data to students and the teachers. And then we evaluate whether the criteria help learners develop language proficiency. We also compare teacher-student self-assessment results. We ask participants, including learners and teachers, their perceptions of the assessment descriptor. So here we use European Language Portfolio, which is a developed version of Common European Framework focused on self-assessment. We also want to use the results to provide implications for how the self-assessment descriptor in CSE used in the local context. In this presentation, due to the time limits, I will only talk about how we involve learners in co-creating the assessment criteria. So the limitation of self-assessment driven by the criteria written by teachers alone. So in the current assessment practice in different corners of the world, to be honest, most of the assessment criteria were written by the teachers, and the students use assessment criteria provided by teachers to do their assessment. However, the assessment criteria written by teachers will lead to different understandings among learners and tutors about the same criteria, and the different understanding leading to the confusion about the feedback provided, the marks given to the same piece of writing. And learning can't be sustainable in any sense if it requires continuing information from teachers on students' work. The advantage of co-constructed assessment criteria for self-assessment is that co-construction facilitates learners' assessment literacy, so they will understand why the assessment is conducted, why those assessment aspects included in their criteria, what should they think about how they need to use those assessment criteria to assess their learning. They also empower learners as assessors to develop their capability of assessing their learning beyond the context or the tasks under assessment, and to also develop their ownership and therefore to increase their motivation to carry out assessment. However, if students construct marking criteria alone, they might, based on what they are happy with, and of course they have their own limited knowledge about the current task, which normally designed by the teachers. So based on the results, based on the discussion with teachers and students, assessment seems to be of most effect when students and teachers become responsible partners, with students progressively taking responsibility for the assessment process and then developing and demonstrating their ability to make informed judgment of their learning, which has been discussed by different cognitive theories, for instance, sociocultural theories, community practice. We also discussed recently about agentic perspectives of assessment. However, there are some reality constraints. We do need to take into consideration the time, okay, the limited class time, students' knowledge about assessment. We do have to take into consideration those reality constraints when involve students in designing the assessment criteria. So in the project, what we do, so we will firstly, to solve the problem or to design the assessment criteria within the local settings, we, the researchers and the tutors created the draft, or we call the pre-modified assessment criteria alongside teaching, learning, and learners' experience. Then we use it in the training session, ask students how they feel about accessibility of the pre-modified descriptors. And we ask the tutors to keep a log based on their observations and their use of the same assessment criteria when judging the same piece of writing. We only change I can statement to can statement. I'll talk a bit more in the next few slides. Then based on participants' perception, we made modification to the draft ELP descriptor or the draft assessment criteria. After that, we ask students and tutor perception again about the feasibility, which means how easily those assessment criteria can be used to judge their assessment task or their writing, and how useful the modified assessment criteria for EFL writing, because we also regarding this as a continuous process. So when the researchers and tutors sat down before the semester started, we took a lot into consideration. Okay, we think the main aim, of course, is to achieve the constructive alignment between assessment, teaching, learning, and learners. So we first look at the instructional focuses based on the textbook they are going to use in their semester. The two main genres are summary and argumentative essays. So based on the genre, we only choose the descriptors on essay and reports, which share similarities to the two genres the tutors are going to focus in their teaching in the semester. Based on the students' previous writing proficiency, the previous exam scores, and the tutor judgments, most of them are at the level of B1 to B2. So we'll focus on the descriptors at A2 to C1. So on A2, we try to motivate students to help them find their learning achievements. Okay, so then we also include C1 level to help them to set their targets. So what's their next step if they already achieve B2? Most students are not very not highly motivated. So in order to encourage them to reflect on their writing experience and their writing quality, we mixed the order of different level descriptor. So they won't have the same rating for the same level of descriptors just by looking at the order of descriptors in the assessment grades. We also think about learners' life experience, so how they evaluate or how they reflect on their daily life. So those students use social media a lot. When in China, they use a lot of WeChat, use emoticons to express their reflections of certain life moments. So we use emoticons to replace numbers. I'll talk a bit more about why we use emoticons rather than the numbers. So traditionally and predominantly in the assessment criteria, it's always be numbers, okay? But we think it might not be the best way to present it. One, we want students to consider self-assessment as a part of their learning process, just like their momentary reflection of their daily life. We don't want them to just do 1, 2, 3, and that's it. We want them to reflect on it. And by using emoticon, which they are much familiar than the numbers in their daily life, when they reflect on their life moments, will help them to think about, have I achieved it? Am I nearly there? I'm not there yet, so what should I do? So to make self-assessment as a formative assessment rather than a summative assessment. After we designed the draft assessment criteria or descriptor, we provided 1 hour training. So the writing tutors provide 1 hour training in their first session. So firstly, the tutor introduced the self-assessment. So what is self-assessment? Why we use self-assessment? What are their learning concerns? Bear in mind, those learners are Chinese tertiary students. They do not have much experience of self-assessment, and they may have concerns. And this has also been reported in existing studies. Students might worry about the reliability of their own ratings whether the tutors will withdraw themselves from the assessment if self-assessment has been conducted. So the tutor discussed all those concerns with students in the whole class discussion. After that, the tutor introduced the procedures of self-assessment. And we use 5 minutes, okay, to introduce the Common European Framework and ELP descriptor, and to explain why we use self-assessment, Common European Framework and ELP descriptor. Because at the time the project was conducted, the assessment CSE has not been published yet, but the initial discussion about CSE has revealed the descriptor will be very similar to Common European Framework based on can-do statements. We explain this to the students, try to raise their motivation to use the self-assessment descriptors, because those are things they are going to use in the next few years. And in the last stage, the teacher demonstrates their decision-making process of using the descriptors when they assess learners' writing. After that, the student carry out self-assessment using the pre-modified descriptors in their summaries, which has been written before the session started. The participants are 2 writing tutors, okay, both of them, one of them have master's degree, the other have doctorate degree in language education. They are very experienced teachers, have been working in the module for several years since its introduction in 2006. The students are 146 university students in the southern part of China. The module is EAP Reading Writing integrated module. The students from 3 subjects, network media, public management, Chinese language and literature. As you can see, their final writing score on average is rather similar, although class 4 seems to have a higher writing score than the rest of 3 classes. So after students use the pre-modified descriptor in the training session, we distributed 9 question student survey about the accessibility and usefulness of pre-modified assessment criteria. We ask students how easy it can be understood, what item they feel really difficult, what information is lacking, and what are their suggestions to improve the pre-modified or the draft assessment criteria. So the student, as you can see, the mean, so we use a scale 1 to 4. 1 means extremely easy to understand. 4 is extremely difficult to understand. If you look at the mean of each class, you can see it's a low to slightly intermediate level of accessibility suggested by the students. The small standard deviation suggested it's the perceptions about the low accessibility seems to shared by individual students. So we ask students, if you felt some of the items were really difficult to understand, can you tell us which items and what caused your difficulties of understanding those items? So we analyzed the items mentioned more than 10 times by the students. Okay, those are the items. For instance, item 11, I can write with reasonable grammatical accuracy and can correct mistakes if they are identified by others. So item 23, I can convey simple information of immediate relevance getting across, which point I feel is the most important. As I mentioned, I ask students to explain what caused their problems. And they mentioned those vocabulary they not often or seldomly come across in their instruction or in their English learning experience cause their problems to use those descriptors. As I highlighted those, so reasonable, immediate relevance, getting across, elementary vocabulary, what is continuous writing, what is intelligible throughout. So those are the words they find really difficult to understand. Then we ask students, so you think those are difficulties, and do you have any suggestions? So we can revise the draft based on their perceptions. So 69 among 115 responses mentioned, well, it's not because of the assessment criteria, it's just because of their own English language proficiency. They need to try to increase their vocabulary size, improve their grammatical, and practice listening and speaking more, and memorize the model sentence structures and essays. But we're looking for the suggestions because improving language proficiency is a cumulative experience. We try to create assessment criteria which they can use immediately. So 37 students mentioned it will be good if we could replace the difficult and vague words with simple or common words. They also asked to organize the script more coherently, but some of their suggestions or their examples varied from each other, sometimes even conflict with each other. They asked to reduce the number of descriptors. So in the training session, they have about 25 descriptors within 30 minutes. That's too much, within 30 minutes to complete the assessment activity. The students suggest use bilingual versions so they can have a Chinese translation, help them to understand the assessment criteria. If possible, give examples to each descriptors. We ask teachers to keep reflective logs based on their observation of how students and how well they can use the assessment criteria, what questions the students asked about the assessment criteria. We get very similar findings. One, the teachers mentioned the difficult words, which they didn't realize when they designed the assessment criteria with the research team. They suggest maybe it is a good idea to place similar items close to each other to make it easy to understand. They also mentioned because the students lack of exposure to authentic English expressions in writing instruction, and they are going to emphasize about to strengthen it in their writing instruction. But it's a good idea to replace some of the vocabulary, but not all of them. They also mentioned student low English language proficiency might relate to their difficulties. So what we do, firstly, we think it is a good idea to create a bilingual version of the assessment criteria, because the bilingual version, one, it can maintain the benefits of reading the assessment criteria descriptor in English suggested, because the tutors and students find it would be useful for them to expose to the authentic English language use. The used bilingual version will be more effective in solving the difficulties caused by the difference in English and Chinese language, because the teacher find sometimes difficult to find the equivalent Chinese expression to the English expression. So use the bilingual version is a good idea. Also, even though we discussed use bilingual version might distract the students from English version and focus on the Chinese version, but we prioritize these assessment tasks. So it is more important for students to understand their learning objectives rather than to remember the vocabulary used in the assessment criteria. Based on student and tutor suggestions, we relocate the similar items further apart rather than very closely to each other, because the teachers find the student seems like give the same ratings for the similar items, but they have questions about, so why these two items listed differently? They seem very, very similar. So to reduce the time to wondering about the similar items when they're conducting self-assessment, we separate them apart. We also reduce the assessment aspect in each session. So we separate the macro level and the micro level of the aspects. So in the 4 sessions, we have constructing summaries. So that in macro level, it is 9 descriptors, 12 descriptors in the second assessment session about language use in summaries, and then 7 descriptors constructing argumentative essays. And the last self-assessment session is about language use in argumentative essay. So then let me see whether it works. Okay. So this might be an example of how it looks like. Okay. I don't know whether you can see it or not. But I will provide the link to the self-assessment grade in one of the articles we published regarding the co-constructing later on. So we made the revision, and then we have the similar questions again, asking students and tutors to evaluate the accessibility of the self-assessment grade. So as you can see, the mean improved from, well, because the first one, based on the scale of the accessibility, the pre-modified descriptor, the mean is 2.58, and the modified is 2.15. So this suggests the improved level of accessibility there. We also ask the students about the feasibility, which means how easily can the assessment descriptor used in their assessment tasks. As you can see, there the mean is 2.92, which means intermediate, a relative high level of feasibility student felt about the use of assessment criteria for their writing tasks. We also ask students about the usefulness of the assessment descriptors. So how useful the modified descriptors. So 98%, roughly about 98% students confirmed the usefulness of modified ERP descriptor of self-assessment. We got a mean of 2.61 on a 4-point scale, 1 extremely useful, 4 not useful. So you can see the usefulness of modified descriptor for self-assessment and writing development seems intermediate at a relatively high level. We ask students, so how do you think? So in which aspect the modified descriptor can help you with your writing, with your self-assessment activity? They reported, so the self-assessment descriptor and the self-assessment activity help them to set learning objectives, okay? So they can attend to those underachieved items in their next assignment. Bear in mind, there are 3 levels of self-assessment there, nearly there, and not there yet. So they can cast attention to those underachieved items. It also increased their learning motivation. They understand where they were and how they should adjust them. It also developed their assessment skills. So they can use the skills developed in this self-assessment activity, and based on the skills, the knowledge they developed there, to improve their assessment performance in the other modules. So this is what we intended to improve when we use self-assessment with this group of students in terms of sustainable assessment. So as I said, if we use teacher assessment criteria for students to carry out self-assessment tasks, it seems that students really confused about why the assessment should be conducted. It is totally okay for the teachers to have the assessment. And if if you ask a student, how do you feel about the teacher feedback? They say, oh no, we don't receive much feedback. It's much more like a very generic feedback about how well the writing piece is and give a mark. And in this project, we try to adopt a participative approach. So we try to involve students in the whole process of assessment design. Although the participation method is rather different, or we say very innovative, because it's not always face-to-face discussion about it. We try to use different method. So there are a few things I would highlight. One, we always listen to learners' concern over self-assessment to address their concern. We align assessment criteria with teaching, learning, and also learners and teachers' experience. We'll support students carry out self-assessment. We will co-construct the assessment criteria, make it a shared domain, and they have shared understanding of the assessment criteria. This will also increase their ownership of the criteria and the assessment itself. In other words, learners should be regarded as conscious consumers rather than passive recipients. Okay, so assessment is used to provide a rationale and legitimacy for the social structures and power relations of modern days. For one's place within this, in traditional classroom, the teacher dominates the assessment design and assessment administration and to provide the results. But if for students to develop their learner agency, they do need to involve in the whole process. The social structure and the power relations need to be transformed in order for our learners to take responsibility of their learning. I provided a half-day workshop on the co-constructing assessment criteria with learners for the language tutors there, and they share their experience with me. If you want to know more about it, there are 3 articles we published based on this project, so you can have a look at it. There is a website there, again, provide the detailed research design and research article there if you are interested in it. So Nia, I'll stop here. Thank you for coming to this session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jiao, for that interesting presentation. We've run a little bit over time. We do have one question if you have.
I can see 3 questions there.
Yeah.
So do you have any evidence that student writing improved following this intervention? Yes, we do, but we haven't reported here. So we find those aspects, students rating as underachieved, so not there yet. In their next few assignments, it seems they pay particular attention to those items. And you can see, for instance, if the students find their writing, their sentence structure is not varied enough, they haven't included the key information in their summaries in the self-assessment descriptor. And in their next assignment, the teacher observes they do improve in those aspects.
Brilliant, thank you. And one final comment we have. I support the participative approach, but when it comes to implementation, situations vary. Some school heads choose to have a standardized assessment across classes. In some cases, school curriculum is not aligned to the assessment criteria from the participative process. How can we deal with this?
It's a very good question, isn't it? And that's why we do need to construct aligned assessment, learning, teaching learners in the local context. Because when you create a common framework, you won't take individual content into consideration. And that's why we adopt the 3 different aspects and why we involve students in it. So my suggestion would always be first, have a look at what you are going to focus, what are your writing instructions. Then pick the assessment criteria which related to your writing instruction. then have the discussion with the students. So why I want to focus this, how do you feel about it? Can you understand those? So involve student in the whole process. And also before you involve student into the process, you need to be really selective in terms of assessment descriptors.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao. We've unfortunately run over time, and the chat box has closed down by the looks of it, so no, we can't receive any more questions, but thank you very much for presenting about your study today. It's obviously very thought-provoking, and we've got some interesting questions from it. So thank you very much for.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye.